For this next story, I got a special guest for you. Me, but from a few weeks ago. It's about a news story that starts with this question. Do you watch this show or do you just listen to this show? Right? Because I've seen a number of people say they listen to me like it's a podcast. You know what? We've always been video first. You can pretty much download the show wherever they have podcasts. Even my sales team, they talk about us like we're a podcast. It just makes things easier. But I ask that because there's a question being debated right now, and that is the podcast boom over? Because as we saw podcasting growing and then absolutely booming during the pandemic, if you've been paying attention recently, there have been some concerning headlines here and there. Shows getting canceled, deals imploding, people getting fired. I mean, Spotify just laid off 1,500 people, nearly a fifth of its staff. You know, when that happened, you had senior culture writer Amanda Silberling writing for TechCrunch that the podcast boom is over, and this week's news is evidence. So adding, as a whole, the podcast industry didn't fail. It's just that Spotify took $1 billion swing and whiffed, and now podcasters have to navigate the fallout. You know, I've been very interested in this situation, especially because of the proximity. It's adjacent, it's close, it's not fully the same thing as what I do. And so we actually reached out directly to Amanda to try to get some insight, starting with how podcasts boomed to begin with.
Before Spotify got super invested in podcasts, it was a very kind of disjointed space. So you'd have a lot of small studios and public radio stations that were just making podcasts, slowly getting advertisers, using them as ways to like engage their fan bases. Shows like Serial were coming out, which became this like massive viral success. And then This American Life has been around for a long time. And there were kind of these like prestige shows that are a gateway for people into podcasting.
You also had shows like Planet Money and Radiolab, but as Defector notes, those are more radio shows just uploaded to the internet. And of course, you had early shows centered around personalities like Mark Maron, Dan Savage, and Chris Hardwick, but those were relatively small and underdeveloped at the time. And so in 2014, a different company transformed podcasting into what it is today, Gimlet Media. And its founder, Alex Bloomberg, created a very popular, very meta podcast called Startup, right, documenting the process of creating a podcast company, with him pitching the idea to a billionaire investor in the first episode, then using the money to hire staff, and then putting out some of the most iconic shows in the industry. Things like Reply All, The Nod, Heavyweight, Mystery Show, Every Little Thing, and other series that pushed the bar on what audio storytelling could be. But then Startup actually ended in 2019, right? And this is podcasting entered a whole new stage of development, the boom. With Spotify buying Gimlet Media and Anchor FM, a platform where many creators actually make their podcasts in the first place for $340 million. I mean, their appetite seemed endless, going on to buy more podcast companies like The Ringer, Parcast, and Megaphone, and then going into highly publicized 8 or 9 figure deals. I mean, they're throwing it at Joe Rogan, Alex Cooper, Harry and Meghan, Barack and Michelle, though also notably those last 2 deals fell through. But main thing, by 2021, Spotify had stolen the top spot from Apple as the #1 US podcasting platform. I mean, that wasn't just a big deal for the company, but for the industry as a whole.
Like podcasts were kind of synonymous with Apple for a while because the pod and podcast is literally from iPod, but there wasn't a lot of innovation in the Apple Podcasts app itself. And once Spotify kind of took this approach of wanting not just to own music streaming, but also to own audio across the board, including podcasts, Spotify made the industry a bit more competitive.
You know, Spotify, they quickly ran into problems that its competitors didn't really have to worry about. Like for one, and it's a big one, making money. Because as it turns out, at least in certain ways, music and podcasts are 2 products that are very hard to make profitable. And so for companies like Apple, Amazon, or Google, right, they can afford to lose money on this type of content. It supplements their larger brand. If you're Google, it gives you more places to throw ads. But if you're largely just a standalone audio company like Spotify, there's so much more pressure to figure out how to make music and podcasts profitable on their own. And so far, 5 years in, they haven't done it. With, for example, in the first 9 months of this year, the company losing $462 million, which is also notable because that's double their losses during the same time period in 2022. Though initially, at least, right, that wasn't even the goal, as Amanda explained.
Generally, these big businesses prioritize growth over making a profit. Companies like Uber, Lyft, Grubhub, like things that you have on your phone and use every day, often are not profitable or are like very rarely profitable. The idea in the boardroom is, okay, well, if you acquire this company or if you invest like hundreds of millions of dollars into getting Joe Rogan exclusively on your app, then this is going to create more value over time. And then in the long run, you will make more of a profit.
You know, also, over the past few years, we've seen Wall Street investors kind of getting tired of the growth-first strategy from Silicon Valley. You know, we've seen an increase in pressuring tech executives to start trying to turn a profit. And so all of a sudden, it's not shocking to see Spotify whipping out the bone saw, with them starting to cut off where they think they can, laying off or reassigning some 5% of its podcasting division in October of 2022, according to a source who spoke to the Times. Also canceling 11 original shows that the company said weren't performing well enough. And of course, that was just the start. We saw 3 more big rounds of layoffs layoffs in 2023. 600 workers in January, then 200 more in June, then 1,500 in December. And if you ask the CEO, he'll say it had to be done. Podcasting acquisitions were simply bad investments. But this is the Gimlet and Parcast unions have a different perspective, with them putting out a joint statement right after the earliest layoffs, where they blame Spotify itself for poor listener numbers, saying that the company's decision to make most of the newly acquired studio shows exclusive to the Spotify platform in 2019, it actually caused their audiences to plummet by as much as 3/4 in some cases, and going on to claim that the company did little or nothing to staunch the bleeding, saying shows languish without marketing support and teams are not given clear audience goals to meet. But with whoever is to blame, it is clear that the studios struggled under Spotify's leadership, with of all things, Reply All, the jewel in Gimlet's crown, coming to an ugly end in 2022, and that after both the show's original co-hosts resigned, one of them seemingly on his own terms and the other because of a scandal involving the union and workplace diversity. There wasn't really a comparable show to replace it, especially because Gimlet hasn't put out any equivalent hit since the early days before Spotify. But, all that said, while Spotify is sometimes used as like an index regarding the health of the podcasting industry as a whole, it's important to remember that while "is podcasting dying" is a strong hook, as Amanda explained, podcasting is far from dead.
I think the good news is that independent podcasters I've talked to have said that Spotify's ups and downs haven't really affected them, because if they have their own business coming from things like Patreon memberships or merch sales or ad sales, Spotify laying off a bunch of people doesn't really affect them.
With, for example, a report last March from Edison Research finding that podcasting reached 90 million weekly listeners last year. We're talking 31% of Americans, up from 7% a decade ago. I mean, these are the highest numbers ever recorded, and revenues are only projected to go up. And this is, podcasts are now on Twitter Spaces. YouTube has its own podcast destination page. But it is also harder and easier to grow than ever, because according to one count, all of those views are dispersed among over 3 million podcasts. You've got upwards of 180 million episodes out there in the world right now, and more are being produced every single day. So as this industry matures, Amanda thinks that we're likely going to see more low-budget amateur content, as well as
celebrity-hosted shows can often be a good bet. Like Jeanette McCurdy just had a new show come out that's been topping the podcast charts. I also think that conversational talk shows have been doing really well. If you're making a show that is doing really deep investigative journalism and really well-produced audio with original music, they're really hard to make.
And so for the sea of small podcasters trying to figure out how to wade through all these structural changes, right, their dilemma is the same as tons of other creators on similar platforms. When given the opportunity, do you take corporate money, you try to grow under their shadow, or do you hold on to your brand and you roll the dice? So for me personally, I just want to say, we wouldn't be able to put out this show every day without the generous support of the U.S. Defense Department. I'm kidding. I sold my show and then bought my show back a long time ago. My belief is staying independent is the best fucking thing in the world, or unless they're going to give you some sort of Alex Cooper contract. But that's also why I'm incredibly against the all or nothing people, the types that are like, I'm going to be a YouTuber, I'm going to be a podcaster, I'm quitting my job right now. Build it up. Play it safe. Allows you to grow, stay safe, get your reps in. I always say I've done a news show for 16 years and I've done it well for 4, maybe 2. But also with this, while Amanda said that while one of these paths can get you some success, the real challenge isn't getting something to pop. It's can you stay relevant for the long run, 10 plus years?
I think it is possible, but a lot of the creators that you see being successful in that are creators that have retained their IP for a long time. If you are on Instagram and have 1 million followers and then your Instagram gets deleted, you don't have the email addresses for your 1 million followers. But then newer platforms like Substack and Patreon make it a point to have you own the email list of all of your subscribers. So I think that creators are gravitating towards having more control in that way. But still, you can't get around the necessity of being on TikTok and Instagram. And if you have 1,000 listeners, you don't know who those people are. You just see a number.
Now with this, as she notes in her article, we're seeing worker-owned media outlets crop up like Defector, Aftermath, and 404 Media, or with those often founded and staffed by journalists who have been repeatedly laid off from mismanaged media companies. And already, we've seen the podcast studio Maximum Fun adopting a worker co-op model, which Amanda also predicts will spread further as listeners lose trust in giants like Spotify. And I actually have to add to what Phil from several weeks ago was saying, because the news hasn't stopped, and we're starting to see giants like Spotify changing the way they're taking on and distributing podcasts, with now as of yesterday, Alex Cooper's Call Her Daddy podcast no longer being exclusive to the platform. And not like in a little bit. When the show aired its newest episode, it went live on all audio platforms, with the back catalog also getting freed up. With the only catch being that Spotify still holds the right to the video of the podcast, right? So that footage is going to be making its way to YouTube or other major platforms. But of course, given the reality of the internet, you still have clips going viral on TikTok. And as far as why this move was made, you had Alex Cooper releasing a statement saying, "For years now, Daddy Gang has been asking to share their favorite Call Her Daddy episodes with friends who aren't on Spotify." And notably, she's not alone here. The only exclusive show Spotify still has right now is Joe Rogan. But also, that contract's up for renewal this year. As far as why maybe Spotify is okay with this, right? Because this is something that could be framed as a defeat for them. But this is, you have places like The Verge framing it as like, this platform has more to gain from getting the ad dollars that come from wider distribution than whatever less tangible platform benefit comes from exclusivity. Right? There's more ad dollars to be spread around, creators get to reach a wider audience. And so it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out both for Spotify and the creators who are no longer exclusive. Though also worth noting, like the whole fight over exclusivity or being everywhere, it's not just podcasting. With most recently the streaming personality Pokimaine announcing that she is leaving Twitch, and actually on her podcast saying that had to do with frustrations regarding exclusivity deals. So there was definitely an airing out of specific grievances regarding Twitch, saying that right now she doesn't want to sign a deal that ties her down to any one platform. But with all that said, I gotta pass the question off to you. What are your thoughts regarding the future of podcasting, exclusivity deals, or really anything we touched on here?